Hello, this is Robert Rickover at Body Learning, and today my guest is Mark Josephsberg, who's an Alexander Technique teacher in New York City. He's been teaching about 10 years, and he works in the Flatiron area and in Chelsea. And our conversation today could go in any one of a number of directions. We are going to explore an idea of Mark's, which is how would the Alexander technique be different if Alexander had been born in 1969 instead of 1869? So, Mark, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Robert.
And just kind of an overview, how would it be different? And where would you like to have Alexander be born?
That's a lot of power.
Yeah.
First of all, how would it be different?
Yeah.
I have no idea, but we could guess, and I'll talk about that more maybe. But as far as where, since I'm in New York City, let's say 34th Street in Manhattan.
All right. So he's born, and what happens next in terms of Alexander technique development?
Again, I'm pretty sure I do not know, but the original thought about this was that if things would be different, like in other words, he was born in 1869 in a certain place, and he wrote and he spoke, and we know about him from in 1885, 1890. If I don't know how the technique would be if he invented it, 100 years later, but how would he be talking about it? It's almost like what would he be like as an Alexander teacher in a way if he were like 40 something years old instead of not around anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And some of his original concepts and their meanings and the words he used, would it be the same words?
Mm-hmm. Well, probably not, right?
Probably not.
Yeah.
And so therefore, I think it's more than just like a kind of a fun exercise into thinking about it, and more of a fun exercise and more like it's more than a fun exercise. And it's more like maybe that could give us some ideas about the way we think about the technique and how we tell people about it in the words that we use.
Mm-hmm. Well, Alexander, as you say, was born in a particular time and place, and not just the time was different, but it was an extraordinary location that he chose to arrive at. It was, we all know in the Alexander world, it was Tasmania, and I don't think a lot of people think a lot more about that. But Tasmania was a really weird place. Are you familiar with the history of that and what it was like there in the 19th century?
A little bit, I'll say.
Yeah, I mean it was the last part of Australia to be settled. It had only recently been settled by the English, in I think around 1820 or so, and of course. England used Australia as a dumping ground for convicts, had been doing that for some time, but Tasmania became convict central. It was like I believe over half the inhabitants of the European inhabitants were convicts. Both of Alexander's parents were convicts, and it also was the site of basically a mass extermination of the Aboriginal people who had been living on Tasmania. I mean, the Aborigines didn't do great anywhere in Australia, but Tasmania was the most violent, quick extinction. And in fact, the last male Aborigine died the very year Alexander was born. So, and people who visited Tasmania at that time reported that an aura of death and destruction lingered over the island. And certainly that must have affected FM.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Um, it also, by the way, housed a notorious prison which did not have any actual walls because there was nowhere to escape. You would die in shark-infested waters or whatever if you tried to leave. So
Hmm.
it was not a great place. And I think the other thing that's kind of important about it, from terms of impacts on Alexander, is that in Australia, the mainland of Australia, if you like, Tasmania was regarded as the wrong side of the tracks.
Hmm.
And of course, in Great Britain, Australia was pretty much regarded as the wrong side of the tracks. So when Alexander made his way first to Melbourne and Sydney and then on to London, he was constantly uh, dealing with this perception of his homeland being not a very good place to be from. And he was a master at changing his accent, changing his affect, and apparently, after a while in England, he kind of gave the impression of being a Brit.
Hmm.
So, how that affects the Alexander technique is an interesting question. But if he'd been born in New York in 1969, he probably wouldn't have those issues to deal with.
Yeah, maybe those issues, I don't know, I guess they would affect different people in different ways, but one way is that constant need to prove yourself, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Right, right. And yeah. So what are some other ways that how would you say, assuming he made, let's assume he made the same discoveries,
Hmm.
probably in a very different way. I mean, Alexander was observing animals very closely,
Hmm.
and unless our guy hung out at Central Park Zoo or went to summer camp, he may not have seen a lot of animals other than squirrels and pigeons, right?
Hmm. And rats.
And rats, yeah, you would have had a good opportunity to see those.
Well, I don't know about, I don't know how the technique would be formed as much as I'm interested in, let's just say, I don't know, like he was an Alexander teacher somehow,
Mm-hmm.
born in 1969. In other words, like, let's say the jargon that he used.
Mm-hmm.
He used certain words like, the words we know means whereby, inhibition, and,
Mm-hmm.
words like that. The question I have is, would he be using those same words?
I doubt he would be using inhibition.
Right. So let's say you don't think he would, and let's say I don't think he would, and some
Mm-hmm.
people out there,
Right.
my contention is that if he wouldn't, then we shouldn't.
Oh, I see. Okay.
That's where I'm going. Like, and if you
Yeah.
think he would, then that's fine,
Mm-hmm.
But if you think he'd be saying something else because it's now 2013 that we're doing this,
Mm-hmm.
um, then that's how we should be speaking about the technique, not something he came up with in 1900.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean inhibition for sure because he was pre Freudian use of that word, and Freud's version of inhibition kind of took over.
Freud won.
Freud won that battle 100%. So I'm sure anyone showing up now would choose some other word. And I have to agree with you. That's not a great word to use.
There's something called behavioral inhibition, which is
Mm-hmm.
a diagnosis you could get. And some of the symptoms are that when let's say you walk into a unfamiliar place with unfamiliar people, you freeze. Not in the sense of shyness, but you freeze in that you can't speak, you can't move your muscles.
Mm-hmm.
And that's called behavioral inhibition. Yeah, it's not a good word, and yet I use the word with students and try to say how positive it all is and how it's such a great, it's a great idea. But I wish there was another word.
Mm-hmm. And in addition to language use, I think his whole approach to getting the word out would have been quite different than
So,
it was for Alexander, the original Alexander.
The original Alexander didn't use the internet, and
Mm.
as I wrote in that little post, because he was old school.
Yeah.
But yeah, what about if he were around now?
Well, we know, I mean, we're kind of assuming that his personality was similar. He made same basic discoveries, right?
Yeah, just for fun, why not?
Because if we don't assume that, I mean, really anything's possible.
Exactly.
Well, we know Alexander was a public really wanted to get the word out. Once he came to a realization of how important his discoveries were and how powerful they were and how useful they were, he used any means necessary or available to him to get his ideas out there. Pamphlets, later on books, letters to the editor, lectures, that sort of stuff. Now, right?
Brochures, flyers.
Yeah, flyers. We have a lot of those in the book articles and lectures that was
Mhm.
collected a number of years ago. And he was not shy about promoting himself.
So, as you said, he used anything that was out there at the time.
I think so. And he was also very quick to latch on to endorsements from anybody who he felt would, carry some weight. In
Absolutely.
his case, in Australia, it was doctors.
Hmm.
In England, it was also doctors, although he had a big falling out with one of them. But it was famous people. He loved famous people.
Hmm. They thought he thought that they would be able to spread the word, whether it was politicians, uh,
Right.
athletes.
Socialites, people that had a prominent place in British society, he would cultivate. Of course, he also visited the States and cultivated people like John Dewey and other philosophers and thinkers in the New York, kind of in that New York circle.
And so, what would he be doing now?
Well, my guess is for him in Australia, London was the place to go. It was the center of the world, really. I think if he were in New York, he might stay in New York, or he might, if he was multimedia oriented, hop on a plane to L.A.
Hmm.
because Hollywood,
Yeah.
and the entertainment business was there, and that would be a great place to make a name for himself and get some famous stars and singers and people like that involved.
I wonder if people listening to this are thinking, "Nah, he wouldn't do that." Like it's like cheapening the technique.
I
And
yeah, I I guess there would be some teachers who might think that, but really, if you look at his own life, he really was out there as much as he could with what was available to him, and I don't see why he wouldn't. I mean, it's hard to imagine he wouldn't have a website or two or three, that he wouldn't be tweeting and on Facebook and doing podcasts,
hmm
making videos. I mean, he had a knack for PR, and I think he would have just used whatever came his way and taken advantage of any famous or well-known students, get their endorsements and get the word out. And he might possibly have moved into the business of training other teachers a lot earlier than he did.
Right. Hmm.
Because everything, if he was born in 1969, things move a lot faster these days. You know, someone has a good idea, it spreads really quickly. And for Alexander originally, in Sydney and Melbourne, um, yeah, he had local reputations, but that wasn't going to cut it really in the outside world. he had to get to London, and even then that was fairly isolated from North America in terms of quick exchange of ideas.
Absolutely.
So I think he'd have done all the equivalent things to get his word out. I guess the big question in a way would be, would he have become seduced by fame and fortune that could likely have arrived at his doorstep? You know?
Fame and fortune as far as
Well, supposing he had really hit it big in Hollywood in the early 21st century,
hmm
and everyone was talking about Alexander, would it have corrupted him?
oh, yeah. I of course I have no idea,
Yeah.
but I think it would have made the job of an Alexander teacher, well, let's say easier.
Assuming he had trained some other teachers,
If he had trained other
but he'd
teachers,
have
that's
to.
right.
He could. I mean, Alexander himself really didn't begin training on a significant scale till he was almost seven. Let's see, in his 60s, right?
Right. Well, let's make
Although he did train, he did train even in Australia. He trained at least one or two teachers there, and he trained people, and he trained his brother for sure. He trained a woman named Lillian Twycross, I think her name was. I think she actually is the first trainee of Alexander's, and he trained some people in London before he started his training course, but it was all on a very informal basis. He might have, he might have, if he'd gotten famous, immediately set up a studio and outsourced the training and churned out dozens of teachers.
Yeah, that's my guess. And for the purpose of this exercise, let's say he did.
Yeah, yeah.
Let's say there would be like a lot of teachers, training courses, his approved whatever training courses.
Hmm.
I think if he did, make it big in Hollywood, as you said, or been on television,
Hmm.
we wouldn't have to worry about an elevator speech. We
Right.
wouldn't have to be
Right. You don't have to
people.
have an elevator speech for you tell someone you're going to have physical therapy.
Exactly.
You don't need an elevator speech.
I've never heard of physical therapy. You don't get that.
You don't get that. But the other thing that might have been dramatically different is that for whatever reason, he never trademarked or copywrote the name Alexander Technique. In fact,
Yes.
I'm not even sure he used that phrase.
Yeah, I know he was calling it the work.
The work, yeah. And, that the implications of that are gigantic, that no one has the legal right to restrict other people from calling themselves Alexander teachers.
Absolutely.
That's a huge factor in what's going in current developments. There was a big court case after Alexander died in England around that very question, and the judgment there was that no one had the right to use it, and it's way too late now for anyone to appropriate it exclusively. But if he had been born in 1969 in New York with attorneys everywhere and probably attorneys of some of his students, I'm sure he would have been advised to copyright, to get a name for his process that maybe wasn't the Alexander Technique,
hmm
and to copyright it.
Yeah.
And that would have had huge implications down the road.
Right. And does that get into, and we don't have to get into this area, but does that get into licensing?
Yeah, well, it would mean that you could not call yourself a practitioner of his thing if you didn't have his permission.
Right. Because right now you could call yourself an Alexander Technique teacher. You can't call yourself a certified Alexander Technique teacher except if somebody just gives out some kind of certification that AMSAT or whatever doesn't approve of.
Yeah, you could call yourself a certified teacher as long as someone certifies you.
That's right.
So I could
That's right.
certify you,
Thank
and
you.
then you could be a certified teacher. I don't. There really is no. You can't say you're a certified AMSAT teacher if you're not a
That's
member,
right.
right?
Yep.
Yeah. So, I mean, that has huge implications about the future development of the work.
Hmm.
Um, Obviously, some people think that's a bad thing because anybody could go out there and set themselves up as an Alexander teacher, and that is a downside, and it has happened, although I don't think it's really happened all that often.
I don't either because it's not exactly where the money is.
Yeah, but the downside of that would be of the the having a copyright or trademark name is it really can be an inhibition, as it were, to progress in the work
Mm.
because you can get a group of people deciding what it is and what can be done and what can't be done, and anything outside the box is viewed with suspicion, and so on and so on.
It's kind of like the way it is now.
Well, no, Mark, you said it. But yeah, I mean, this is veering into current Alexander politics, but
Okay, so
yeah.
how about this? You mentioned, AMSAT.
Hmm.
Would he be a member?
Well, he, he never, um, excuse me, he never was real keen to have any society in the original Alexander.
Hmm.
Um, But again, I think he'd been born in 1969. He would have probably, after copywriting the name, then set up a mechanism for churning out teachers of his work,
Hmm.
and probably he would have created some kind of certifying body, and he'd probably, yeah, I imagine he would be a member of it.
Hmm.
Um, you know, who knows? But I would imagine that everything would be just very, very different in that regard. And personally, I don't think it would have been as I think long term would not be good for the work.
Hmm.
But that's just my personal view.
The other thing I was just thinking is, just to go back to jargon for a second.
Yeah,
We
yeah.
talked about ambition. The word posture is a very popular word,
Oh yeah, yeah.
and it's got negative connotations for us in rigidity and, stomach in, chest out, shoulders back, stick your chin in, imagine a rope yanking your head up and all of that kind of stuff. But I wonder what the current Alexander, the new one, would think about it. And maybe I'm wondering also if the word posture would have a different meaning
Hmm.
because of him.
Yeah, we've done an interview on that, which I haven't yet processed, but yeah.
Right, right, right.
Um, Boy, that's a really interesting question. I think that he was the kind of guy that he would see that word was out there, which it probably wasn't in the same way in his time,
Hmm.
and he would say, "Well, yeah, we're gonna appropriate that, and we're gonna help people with their posture." I think
Hmm.
so.
Yeah, interesting. And maybe have a different idea about how to help them with their posture, not the common, way that when you tell somebody I'm an Alexander teacher and they snap to attention.
Yeah, I think he would have been very aware of the limitations of that word as it's currently used, and he would have addressed that in some way.
Hmm.
There's another question that kind of comes up as well: is how much would he be working on his own, developing his own ideas by himself, and how much would he be kind of soaking up other ideas that were in the ether?
Mm.
And I think a lot of people, I mean, the classic Alexander story is that he's in this obscure part of the world working on his own with his mirrors for 9 or 10 years, and out pops the Alexander technique, which is totally and completely false. I mean,
Mhm.
timeline wise, it doesn't work, and it's just wrong. But the other thing is that even where he was in out there on the edge of the empire, he was aware of stuff, and he was certainly aware of things like the Delacroix method, which and there's a big discussion about this on Facebook. There has been as we talk. He actually held himself out as a teacher of that method, and for a while. And I think he may very well have been aware of Stanislavski's work. It was the right time frame. He read books. He was interested in acting. It'd be hard to imagine that he wouldn't have known about it. And I think if he'd been born in 1969, it would have been impossible to avoid all that other stuff,
Right, including neuroscientists.
Well,
We've learned about neuroscience.
Oh, sure. I mean, neuroscience, and even if he personally didn't stumble onto it, he'd have students who would know about it.
Absolutely.
He would have some awareness of other somatic processes like Feldenkrais and Rolfing and Pilates. All of those things he would at least know about.
I don't know what he would think of Pilates or anything like that, but I think the neuroscience, I think he might be into that, because he was sort of talking about neuroscience in a way when he was talking about changing habits.
Mm-hmm.
I know there's one story somewhere where he was saying that if you have a way to get to a lake, I believe he said, and you kind of trample down the grass, and that's the way you go, then you discover a new way which is shorter, but you have to trample down that grass. And then you do that, and then that becomes your new way of doing things. If somehow you make a mistake and you go back the old way, all of those weeds and everything have overgrown, which is kind of like, it's very interesting. That's how we can form a new habit, by practicing, and you form a new groove in the brain. And I think it's a really good metaphor for what they're discovering with thinking, that they can actually see that now.
Yeah. Oh, I think he'd have been fascinated by current developments in neuroscience. Yeah. And as long as we're fantasizing here, the work that's been done in the field of mirror neurons. Are you familiar with that? Which basically, one way to look at that is that actual hands-on touch, one person to another, is just a matter of degree. There is no essential difference from being in the same room with someone, or putting your hand on them is just more of something. It's not like it's a brand new thing. And in fact, even being in another room with a TV connection has elements of that too. That
those same neurons get fired.
They get fired, yeah. And it takes away. It kind of weakens the need for individual, personal, hands-on lessons. And he might have picked up on that right away, especially if he was out there in Hollywood and trying to capitalize on his success. He might have said, wow, let's get some group stuff going here. Let's get some DVDs, some courses, train people at home. Who knows?
That's right. And you could think of it as it weakens the need for the hands-on thing, or maybe it doesn't, and it just strengthens those other ways.
Yeah, the hands-on could be like for the really rich. They get the hands-on. Everybody else just
because that's the ultimate way, is hands-on, but these other ways can work.
That could well be what would have popped out of all of that. And who's to say whether that's better than what we have now or not? I kind of would think it might be better in some ways, but
right. I have more questions than I do answers.
I think it is a really interesting. I think it is really interesting to have in the back of our minds when we say Alexander thought this or Alexander wrote this,
Right.
that he really came out of a very specific time and place.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a time and place that was about as different from what we could imagine today and still be English speaking, let's say, as you could get.
Yeah.
And the influences on him, his education was not there was nothing traditional about his own education. The other thing, which we haven't touched on, is he was pretty much the sole support of this large family.
That's right.
And he was constantly having to send money back to Australia and bring poor relatives over to England and so on. And that probably affected his teaching in some way. Who knows?
Who knows? And that would be another topic, maybe for a podcast, of money and the Alexander technique.
Oh, yeah. That would be an interesting.
Money.
Yeah, that'd be. Well, that's a hot topic these days on Facebook, isn't it? And in the whole Alexander world. Yep. Well, maybe this. When you originally brought up 1969, my first thought went, "Hey, he could have been born in Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco, a love child of a couple of hippies or student radicals or whatever, which would have been."
He'd be a 2-week-old hippie, but a 2-week-old love child. Yeah, exactly.
Anyway, so my guest for this whimsical conversation has been Mark Josephsberg, an Alexander teacher in New York. And if anyone listening to this has an idea for another variant on this conversation, or an idea for something that might follow in their minds, a follow-up conversation on a topic of this sort, contact either one of us, and maybe Mark can do his first podcast interview. We're nudging him in that direction.
That's right. I'm going in that direction.
Absolutely, you're going in that direction. So, Mark, thanks so much for this.
Great. Thanks a lot, Robert.